guys, I hope you're doing well and having a wonderful spring break. I am here to do another music history class for you, highlighting one of our very loved and most famous composers of all time. You'll probably recognize his name. It is Ludwig van Beethoven. I'm sure most of you have heard of Beethoven. Just to give you a little recap, we actually talked about this on our last video about the classical periods of music. We typically refer to all of music as classical music in this genre. However, classical music is actually divided up into 4 different time periods. We talked about the first one on our last class when we highlighted Johann Sebastian Bach. And that time period, or that musical period, is the Baroque era. The second one that we'll be talking about is the classical era. This is the time period when Beethoven was born and began his career. The third musical time period is the Romantic era. And then the fourth one, the last one, is the 20th century. Beethoven was born in 1770. So he was born right on the heels of the turn of the classical era. The classical era began in about 1750, depending on which resource you look up on that date. But he was born in 1770 in Bonn, Germany. His father was his very first teacher. However, he did not have the best relationship with his father. His father was unfortunately a drunk as well, and it is said that he would sometimes wake up Beethoven in the middle of the night to perform for his drinking companions, which obviously led to a very strained relationship. He did perform his very first recital at the age of 7, and by the age of 12, he was performing in the court of the organist Christian Neef. Beethoven was also an accomplished composer at a young age and had his first keyboard piece published in 1783 when he was only 13 years old. At the age of 17, he decided to travel to the musical capital of Vienna. He wanted to seek out no one else but Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was a very famous composer and pedagogue of that day. We don't know for sure if he did find Mozart or not, but shortly after, he found out that his mother was ill, and so he returned to his hometown. Unfortunately, his mother did pass away, and his father died shortly thereafter in 1792. He began to use his ability to perform and compose to support his 2 younger brothers. So Beethoven went back to Vienna to study with the famous composer Joseph Haydn. If you've ever heard the Hallelujah Chorus, then that was written by Joseph Haydn. He and Haydn, though, didn't quite see eye to eye. They became friends, but in a musical aspect, they didn't always agree. Beethoven was very different from most composers of that time. He wanted to experiment and do different things than other composers were comfortable with. He lived in Vienna, making very little money, unfortunately, but he did gain a lot of popularity. Beethoven's first mature work was published in 1795 when he was 25 years old. He received a few job offers once he was a music director, but he was so loved by his wealthy friends that they ended up banding together to try to pay for Beethoven's yearly salary. He made about 1,400 florences a year, and that was actually quite a bit of money for a musician of that time. He became one of the very first musicians to live off of a musical salary while not being employed by a court. It was during this time when he was in Vienna that he wrote his famous Pathetique and Moonlight Sonata. Sadly, Beethoven began to lose his hearing in his early years in Vienna, and it got so bad in 1815 that he actually ended up completely giving up performing in public. He just simply could not hear the orchestra while he was playing for a symphony. It is actually said that when he was conducting one of his own symphonies, he could not hear the standing ovation behind him. He had to be physically turned around so that he could see what was happening. Imagine living your whole life to either play or compose music and even not even being able to have the ability to have a conversation with a friend. It was very difficult and depressing for Beethoven, and it was during this time that he almost thought about completely quitting writing music. By 1819, he was completely deaf. But fortunately for us, Beethoven did not stop with his musical compositions. He began to they say at this time, he began to actually write music for himself. His later works are some of the most famous of all time. You might recognize the piece Ode to Joy from the Ninth Symphony. It was during this time that he wrote that piece. One resource says that a visitor questioned the style of his later works because it was very different from the style of music at the time. And Beethoven said in response, "It is not for you, it is for a later age." And this couldn't be further from the truth, because Beethoven is known as the bridge from classical music to the Romantic period, which started later in the 1820s. Beethoven composed a total of 9 symphonies, 5 piano concertos, 32 piano sonatas, and 16 string quartets. He also composed chamber works and cantatas and 1 opera. Beethoven died in 1827, probably from some health issues that he had had during his life. He had over 20,000 people at his funeral. And usually what happens is a composer becomes extremely famous after they die. Beethoven is probably one of the most famous composers of all time. He was extremely tenacious and pushed through some very difficult circumstances and stayed true to his passion for music. And I hope that the rest of us will do the same.